What do I think of first? Well, I'd say that he is a very exciting person, fun to be around. In fact, that's what my children said when I asked them, you remember John when we lived in Poughkeepsie? What do you think of when you think of John? And they said, he was fun to have around. But he was a brilliant person, a lot of balls in the air at any one time, many different projects, and he would sort of go from one room to another and to one lab to another, you know, spreading ideas and trailing cigarette ashes as he went along.
So he spent time with your family too?
Oh yes, yes. He, at the time that I was working with him in Poughkeepsie, of course he didn't have a family, so he sort of wanted to work day and night, and I had this problem of having the doorbell ring, you know, late in the evening or early in the morning, or whenever John had a bright idea that he wanted to share with me. And of course the children loved him because he was so different from most of the stuffy blue suitors that we had around.
Do you recall your first meeting with him?
Well, I don't know exactly when it was, but it was probably early 1957. I was a member of this planning group for the Stretch computer. You know, there was Stretch had a project between IBM and Los Alamos, and I was working at Los Alamos at the time. And there was a planning group, and I was a member of the group from the Los Alamos side. And then later on, when I joined IBM, I just changed sides of the table and became a member from the other side. So it was sometime about, I'd say early in '57, on one of these meetings that I first met John. And I recall very plainly our having lunch one noon in the old Poughkeepsie research cafeteria, and there was Steve Dunwell and John and I and Vice President John McPherson, who was one of the real supporters of the Stretch project at the time. And I remember Steve asked John to please describe, you know, how he saw how we could improve the concurrency of operation on the Stretch and speed it up. And John started describing this in his usual enthusiasm, and he ended up drawing on all of our napkins, you know, timing diagrams, timing charts on the napkins, you know, explaining how you could start this instruction before that one was finished, and the memory would still continue to operate while you were doing this, and that sort of thing. And I also remember that I thought this is something that one could do on another computer, you know, and it's particularly I was thinking of a 704, and it would also be a very valuable design tool, I thought, for Stretch. And so that was sort of the main remembrance that I have of the first time I really sort of got turned on to John's ideas.
Now, you mentioned something that I've heard about from somebody else about these trips between Los Alamos and
Yes.
Poughkeepsie. So maybe you could explain that to me a little bit more, because I know Dunwell mentioned that John was going back and forth. Was that
Yes.
at the same time that
Yes.
you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah, we had meetings sort of at both places between Los Alamos and IBM. The original contract called for there being a joint design effort, and so this was fulfilling part of the contract.
So you were on the staff at Los Alamos?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's right.
Maybe you could say
Yes, I was one of the heavy users of computing at that time, so that's why I was on the committee.
Hold on 1 second.
How are we doing on audio with the paper and wrestling? I would say hear a little bit of that paper.
Okay, maybe we should put the paper away because...
Oh, really?
I was concerned about that. And how are the eyes? The eyes are good.
Good, okay. You think you can characterize John Cocke for us?
Characterize him. I think I would say that he was a really a brilliant person who got a lot of other people to work on his ideas. One of his few failings was the fact that he didn't like to write, and it was hard to get him to ever write anything. And I know that when I was working with him from the period of 1957 to 60 or thereabouts, that I used to go around, sort of follow him around, taking notes and trying to capture his brilliant ideas as they were bubbling forth. And then I used to do all of the programming. He was, although he was a good programmer, he was too impatient. He already was on the next idea before he could finish one program. So I would do all the programming for us, and I would write all the reports for us. And I think that was the same mode he used for other people that I have.
Yeah, on that where he said, although he was a good programmer part, he had some leaves were coming out.
That's going to happen.
That's all right.
Yeah.
That's real life.
That's right.
Okay. Maybe you want to start back a little bit. How you followed him around?
Can't remember just what I said.
Well, it doesn't have to be exactly the same words. It's the
Yeah.
idea that's important.
So I used to, when I was working with him in the period 1957 to 1960 or so, I used to follow him around and try to capture as many of his brilliant ideas as I could before they vanished, and write them up. And he was, although he was a good programmer himself, he didn't have the patience to really carry through with something, so I ended up doing most of the programming and also writing the reports and that kind of thing. So it was an exciting time, except for the odd hours, and since I did have a family and children of my own, I sort of wanted to spend a little regular time with them once in a while, but John was essentially working all the time.
So were you one of the people who suffered late night phone calls as well?
Yes, phone calls too, and every once in a while John would get extremely upset about some decision in IBM, and he would be convinced that he was going to have to quit the corporation, and I suspect he still gets upset that way, but he probably doesn't threaten to quit anymore. Anyway, I remember several times trying to convince him that he shouldn't do anything rash.
You want to talk about some favorite memories?
Favorite memories, I really have a lot of favorite memories of John, but I think that one that sort of stands out in my mind right offhand, is kind of a little thing, was that at the time in Poughkeepsie, the coffee vending machines used to give back change. I think they would give back like 2 pennies on a cup of coffee or something like that. And I noticed that John would, when he would get change from the coffee machine, he would throw these pennies into an oatmeal container, the round cardboard containers that he had sitting on his desk, and he would throw these pennies into this cardboard box. And then one time I happened to notice when we were working together that he not only did he have that one, but he had several others in his desk. And I mentioned this at home, and the children at that time were doing coin collecting, and so they got very excited about the idea. Could they go through his pennies for their coin collection? And so I said, well, why don't you ask him? And of course John was very happy to have them do that. And I know we had like 2 tables completely covered with piles of pennies while the children were sorting these out by date and by mint and so on. And so I then eventually replaced the pennies that they took with dollar bills and gave them back to John. Another thing that I recall was that one time we were going down to a meeting in White Plains. Seems like we were always being called down to White Plains because the stretch project was continuously in financial trouble. And so that I remember John and I and Daniel Slotnick were riding down, and I don't know whose car it was, but it was a VW Bug, and I remember we were very crowded in this little car. And John and Dan were arguing the whole time that we were going down about multiple processors and parallel processing and how you'd connect parallel processor together and how you could program them. And all of these, of course, are very, very common topics today. I mean, that's still cutting edge. And anyway, then I found recently when I was going through my old boxes a report which written by Dan Slotnick and John. I'm sure Dan wrote it with listing John as a co-author, describing multiple processing and how one could program multiple parallel computers. Dan then left IBM not too long after that and started the so-called Solomon project, which was supposed to have 1,000 computers, you know. And then later on he went to Illinois and did the ELIAC 4 project. So, but I remember at the time John didn't think very highly of this idea. He said that he thought it was kind of a nuts idea, and that you could do a lot other better things to speed up computers and to try to do multiprocessing. I'm sure he changed his mind since then.
One of the things I keep hearing about John is how he's had these ideas for a really long time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's
Yes, that's right. And a lot of things just sort of keep coming up over and over again. And I've been teaching at University of California, Santa Cruz in computer engineering, and in a computer design class, quite often I'll be asked a question, you know, by students about something that I hadn't prepared for. And it's surprising how often I think back to how did we do that on stretch, and I come through with an answer on that basis. And it's so a lot of the basic ideas, you know, have been around a long time.
We had a little noise where he said how we did it on stretch.
Yeah.
And how he wasn't prepared for this.
Right. So we
Well,
got
one little tosser,
Sure.
just a
Hold
little
on a
more
second.
powder on one little. Okay, Diane.
oh, we're going. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a funny question.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about John's favorite music?
Favorite music? I don't think I can answer that.
Okay.
I don't remember.
Because we're trying to think about what kinds of music we ought to have that accompanies the...
Yes,
the
I never really had any recollection of his being a music fan, but maybe he is. That may be a side of his personality that I never plumbed.
It was a legitimate question.
Yeah.
I'm not probing for any secret answer that you do or do not know.
I won't make up anything.
Okay. How about John during off hours? Are you familiar with his behavior, and was there such a thing?
Well, I don't know if he ever had any off hours. I think he was always thinking about computers all the time. But he liked to ski, and he would sometimes go down to North Carolina, where he came from, you know, and down there, and I remember that he was always trying to get me and my family to go down there with him when we lived in Poughkeepsie, and I regret that we never did, but it just never worked out because of school and things like that. But he did like the outdoors, and I know he one time went to South America for skiing, you know, things like that. So.
Do you think that you can name a particular contribution that was most important, either to IBM or the history of computing?
I don't know. He had this ability to be interested in almost anything, you know. Of course, even his background was originally in mathematics, and so he had this sort of a deeper understanding of engineering than most people who worked in IBM have. And he had this ability to sort of become interested in any subject and then plunge into it and sooner or later ask all the key questions.
Now, do you think that,
We have about 2 minutes on this here.
well, maybe should just run by that last question, the other question again about how the ideas keep coming around, and how in your teaching you noticed that.
Oh yes, when I noticed that when I was teaching this class in computer design at the University of California in Santa Cruz in computer engineering, where I am now, that quite often something would come up in class that I hadn't prepared for. You know, students would ask a question about something, and I would always think, you know, how did we do that on stretch? And sure enough, often enough, I would be able to come up with the answer. So there's a lot of coming around again of the old ideas. Every time the technology changes, ideas which have become obsolete now suddenly are open again to be reconsidered. At the end of the minutes.
Yeah, that's probably fine.
State universities while you're taping me. No, you won't. With the TV camera down.
I will say.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let me tell you one thing that I didn't mention before, and that is that we have been approached to put these tapes into an archive. Probably, I think it was the Smithsonian that approached us, and so it's quite possible that they will go in. However, they won't go in raw.
Sure, I understand.
Put it delicately edited, so anything that might be you prefer not said, you
Sure.
certainly edit out. That's fine. So you ought not worry about that. I'd like to hear a little more, if you would tell us about your specific involvement with Stretch and any of the other projects with John, and how your working relationship went.
Yes, I'd say that right after I arrived as an employee in Poughkeepsie in August of '57, I sort of almost immediately started working with John on this idea that I mentioned earlier of doing the simulation for design purposes of Stretch. And so we put together this program on the 704, and we were writing in a 704 assembly language at that time. Even Fortran was, although it was around, it was just an experimental tool, and nobody wanted to do serious work with it. So we wrote this, what became known as the Cocke Kolsky simulator, and it was used over the next 2 or 3 years, you know, thousands of times for design changes. And we knew that the exact timings that we got out of the simulator were not necessarily precise, but changes were much more accurate. I mean, you could do a study of what it would do if you changed this timing a little bit, or that one versus this. And so that these differential changes we felt were really much more accurate. And I know one of the main things that I recall that we accomplished was that we made it possible for Stretch to use a single uniform memory instead of having 2 different categories of memory the way it was originally planned. And in particular, Stretch was originally designed to have an instruction memory and data memories made out of different technology. And our simulation results showed that there was no reason to do this, that you should make them all out of the same technology, which also then made the memories larger, which the customer appreciated. So essentially we worked on that. We also worked on a logic simulator in 1958, which was essentially to start simulating at a slightly lower level in the whole thing. And then we had plans to also go to an execution simulator where we were going to actually be able to simulate the arithmetic operations of Stretch, but we never did get that far. The final report was written up sometime in 1959, and I know the publication was in the Eastern Joint Computer Conference in December of 1959, which incidentally was John's first outside publication aside from his thesis, and I was always felt proud that we had this title, Virtual Memory in the Stretch Machine, you know, as the first publication. Of course, virtual memory had a different meaning at that time. It's not the same as what we think of when we say virtual memory now, but of course I don't tell my students that.
So, how did the working relationship go? You say we did this and we did that. What does that mean in terms of a day-to-day or hour-to-hour?
Yeah, all right. I guess the schedule was not very uniform, and of course quite often we were called upon to present results at meetings, and it seemed like in between times I was always writing reports, because somebody was always demanding more about this and more about that. So it was a hectic period, and one of the main things that I regretted about leaving the East when I got an opportunity to move west was that I wouldn't be able to work with John on a close basis anymore. Of course, we kept in touch by phone and occasionally at meetings, but it was never quite the same.
So you had this really close relationship.
Yes, we were working very closely together for a while. And of course, there was a group of us that were close friends. Sullivan Campbell, of course, was a really close friend of John's and mine too, who unfortunately died in an automobile accident, in 1972. So he's been missed all these years. We did work together again on the ACS project, and I think someone else is going to be describing that in more detail, but I was in Palo Alto and the ACS project was in Menlo Park, and I was designated to be the data processing division representative to the ACS project, so I did attend a lot of the meetings and so on, but it was never the same. I mean, there were different cast of characters, and the computing field and IBM both had changed a lot in those intervening 6 or 7 years, whatever it was. It just wasn't possible to do the bold things that we could do on the stretch.
Although I think,
Right.
thanks. So you sound regretful about
About the ACS, yes,
Yeah.
I think so. And the project collapsed mainly because of technology. It was not quite available at the time. But I think in a greater sense, it wasn't possible for ACS to take on the entire System 360 line, head on, the way Stretch took on the 704 and have a hope to win. There wasn't that big margin of technology advantage at that time. Of course, the ACS machine was eventually built, but it was built by Amdahl Corporation, as the Amdahl 480 or whatever it was called, 2 or 3 years later.
wait until this guy moves further out of the way.
It's going to start shredding again.
They are shredding over there. I know I can hear the rumble of the shred. It's not right coming in. Having worked so closely with John, I know that you have ways of characterizing him as a person, not just as a researcher.
Oh, yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, maybe you could recall for us some of this, the notion of John and his personal style, John as a person.
Yes.
Either or both of those.
Yes. Well, John, of course, in addition to being a brilliant scientist, was really a very human person, and I always considered him a close personal friend. And as I mentioned before, Sullivan Campbell and Betty Lou Campbell, his wife, and we were all always sort of going around together. The three of us were very close at that time, and the other members of the Stretch team were important to me too, but of course they were more like colleagues, not in the same sense as being close friends. I could always count on John, you know, to come through if I needed some problem or other. In fact, I remember one of the last acts when I was working in Poughkeepsie was that he took me and the children, our 4 children, to LaGuardia Airport in his car when I was leaving to go west. My wife was already, I guess she was still staying behind at the house to clean it up or something. And anyway, John took me and the 4 children and all of our suitcases and everything, we were all crowded into his car, you know, and it was pouring rain. And in spite of all of these distractions, he was still discussing technical details, you know, right up to the last minute. So I always, you know, think of little episodes like that. And that was one of the things that I really missed after I left there.
How about his style?
Style. I think that John's real style was essentially, he had this ability to sort of be naive about fields and not be intimidated by experts. I mean, he would go straight to an expert in some field that he knew nothing at all about and start, you know, grilling him on why can't you do this and why can't you do that, and yet he would do it in such a way that he didn't antagonize people, and that he, in fact, quite often, you know, they ended up collaborating with him as a result. You know, he had this ability to not be intimidated by traditional boundaries in academic or other fields, and just, you know, sort of go straight to the subject and start grilling somebody, you know, whether it's brain surgery or or whatever. And so he had this ability, which not very many people have.
How's the audio? Got a lot of mess through that one?
Got
Yeah.
the airplane flying over.
Airplane and the 2 doors open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
You want to try that whole thing again?
Yeah.
About his personal style and ability not to be intimidated.
Yes. One thing unique about John was he has this ability to challenge experts in the field without being intimidated by them. You know, he would sort of bore right in and ask this in a naive sort of way these very difficult questions, and which without antagonizing people. And most people, if they tried to do this, you know, they would end up antagonizing people or feeling like they were treading in the wrong place. But John had this ability to do this, and quite often the people would end up, you know, collaborating with him on some subject or another as a result. So that was, I'd say, one of his really strong points, was this. He still retained this naivete and ability to go into new fields and not worry about the traditional boundaries between what field you're supposed to work in.
Great. That was just fantastic. I liked it a lot. Let's see. What else do you think we should be asking you to tell us?
I don't know. I think that you probably will get different stories from people who have worked with John more recently. Of course, we have kept in touch, as I said, but not. It's not the same, you know. And I was very sorry to hear of his recent illness and so on. And I gather that he's recovering nicely from that. Okay. You're going to ask the question?
I'm not on the tape anyway, so
I see.
the question is that you want to address.
Yeah. How did John influence me directly? Well, I'd say that he certainly influenced the work that I did on the Stretch project, and I know that later his enthusiasm for compilers, and he would be explaining to me, you know, how one could do this optimization and that optimization and so on. That certainly triggered off an interest in that field, and I did start projects here at Palo Alto later in both in microcode and in Fortran compiling, which ended up being very important to the performance of our IBM machines. I'd say that John influenced me probably a great deal in my decision to come to IBM in the first place. After all, I did have a good job at Los Alamos, and but it was I'd say a combination of Steve Dunwell and John and Sullivan Campbell that sort of convinced me that these are the kind of people I really wanted to work with, and so I gave up my job and flew in with IBM.
Seems to do all right.
If you want to use it, there was that guy walking
Right.
through.
Okay, let's try that one again so we don't have that distraction.
Okay. The let's see, I lost a thought here. Well, I think that John also had a very great influence on my coming to IBM in the first place, because certainly the combination of Steve Dunwell and Sullivan Campbell and John Cocke sort of convinced me that these are the kind of people that I really would like to work with. And so I gave up what was really quite a good job at Los Alamos to throw my lot with IBM.